It's raining. I think it's like great ambiance. I got our pool towels hanging up that we didn't get to use today. So seems like it's the perfect atmosphere. Already messed up. It seems like it's the perfect time to talk about another supermodel text. And this one's a really special one to me. I am not your perfect Mexican daughter. It's a real special one to me. You can see I have all sorts of marked up in here, and I wrote a lot about it. I don't want to forget everything I want to say about it. And I don't usually like to read off a teleprompter per se, but I just want to make sure that I capture everything and why this is so important and to highlight in your classroom. So, first of all, as a Mexican American, I related a lot to the cultural details in this book. The good, the bad, the awkward. Right from the title, I felt a connection because I'm not a perfect Mexican son, obviously. But besides that, I also chose to read this as part of my efforts to decolonize the literacy curriculum. I tried to read a variety of young adult lit texts, more modern texts that covered a spectrum of cultural backgrounds. So why not start with my own culture, Mexican culture, and self-reflect about how it defines me today, which I feel like this metacognitive sort of practice, self-reflection practice, when modeled openly in front of students, it can only build your credibility with the students and give you some like relationship points, building points with them. And they get to know you as a person, and they will hopefully be more open and willing to trust your lesson plans as the year goes on. I think especially if you're teaching virtually, revealing some little details about yourself, let them get to know you, is going to be important. And also spend the time to get to know them is going to be important if your virtual curriculum is going to be successful. Besides all that good relationship stuff, there are 3 other academic reasons why I think everyone should read this text. First, number 1, study the author's narrative style. How would you describe it? Focus on how the main character, Julia, introduces the details. This can be kind of your anchor objective that you do throughout the entirety of the reading. Number 2, character study. Specifically the characters Ingman and Simmons. They're teachers in the text, and we'll go over that, the exact excerpts that I would use in class, pages 28 through 31 and 34 through 37. And of course, the third, study the conflict and self-reflection through writing between the older and younger generations and traditional and blended, or more specifically, Americanized cultures. We'll get more into that too. All right, let's backtrack, and now let's just go over like studying the author's narrative style, because I think this is a really cool technique that they use. You see, the main character, Julia, her narrative style, because she's the one telling the story, it's a very first draft, unfiltered, sometimes uncensored technique to tell the story. It's all from her perspective, and very much like a teen, I like the first draft in very emotional type of way she approaches every story detail. So the technique creates a very relatable voice, and one I think that can be harnessed to liven up stuffy nonfiction essays if done properly. So like if a student was integrating this technique into their nonfiction writing, what effect would it have on the tone and to the audience if it would just abruptly switch to this very informal style, and if it was a very formal essay? I can imagine a well-developed, very formal essay paragraph suddenly and abruptly waking up its audience in the closing statement in a very informal style. So for example, you might tell your students to just, as you read, how would you describe the narrator's voice? You may even give them like your tone worksheet handout to use those tone words to help them precisely describe it. But you also might want to scaffold it out and have them categorize, just opening up to like a random page. So like I really like, this is a technique I learned from the Conference on English Leadership from one of my favorite people, where he will say, okay, someone give me a number between 100 and 200. Give me a number between 100 and 200, Stark.
150.
150, okay, 150. Open to a random page and read a section of it and have them decide and classify it. Is this being told from first, second, or third person perspective? immediately. Like, I just pick a random paragraph, put my finger on it. I realized I probably should have been nicer when I saw her at the masquerade. I just didn't feel like explaining about my sister. That's not really the kind of news I'm eager to deliver, especially during a party. That's it. So first person, right? Because it has those first person pronouns. So the author's choice and perspective is going to affect the overall tone of the piece and whether it is very formal or informal voice telling the story. And identifying this can tell you about the age and maturity level of the narrator or main character. And all these details are important and interesting to word nerds like us because diction or word choice is a passive way to build characters without explicitly saying, like, Julia is young and immature. You just find that out because you're getting her train of thought, right? So I don't have any specific excerpts for the narrative style, but if you do that, just random picking a page, have students pick them out, I think they can pick up on that. So you could do another one and use the tone worksheet. Say, okay, now pick a number. See, how many pages is this? I have the hardback edition of this, by the way. So it's 344 pages. So I could say, okay, pick a number between 200 and 300. Hey, Stark, pick a number between 200 and 300. 200
and I'd say 60.
260, okay, that sounds good. And I just open up to a random paragraph and say, okay, I want you to tell me the tone of this paragraph I'm randomly going to read using that tone vocabulary list. And tell me why you think that's the most precise or accurate term to describe the tone here. Andale, mija, she says and squeezes my shoulder. You need to put some weight back on. It's funny how in the United States I'm too fat, and in Mexico I'm too skinny. I know Tia is worried about me. The Montenegro women are excellent warriors. There's many ways you can read that, and that's one of those nice cultural details that I can definitely connect with. I used to be, fun side note, I used to be flaca to my grandma, but when I wasn't flaca anymore, she had no problem telling me that I was gordo, which means a little chunky. So, very honest people. So they could pick something like that, or maybe a longer paragraph to just determine the tone, or put it up on your overhead projector, have students read it, or if you're teaching virtually, on your display somehow, have them read it and determine what would the tone be. I mean, you could even scan it in the Flipgrid. I'm sure that would be fine. Just one section, not the whole book. Don't want to break copyright laws. That's not what we're trying to do here. The second thing, and I think this is probably where I would start, sorry for starting out of order, but I think this would be a fun character study if you weren't going to read the whole text in class, but wanted a good excerpt just to break things up and teach your students a new writing technique. I would do the character study between Mr. Ingman and Mr. Simmons. Now, there are two teachers in the text, which I think overall had a really interesting conversation with one of my favorite PD partners about this. I think it's fun to look at how teachers are portrayed in young adult lit texts. Pretty interesting. It'll be an ongoing series from multiple books, and one we'll tap into as we read more books during our supermodel text videos. The point of this is that the author introduces these two characters using very different styles that they're worth examining and maybe embedding in your own writing style, or at least keeping in your toolbox. So see if you notice and pick up on that. I'm going to read a quick excerpt on one of the teachers. It starts on page 28. Page 28, it's the first paragraph after the kind of break. I don't like most of my teachers because they're as interesting as a bucket of rocks, but English with Mr. Ingman, English teacher, is always fun. There's something about Mr. Ingman that I liked right away. He looks like a dorky suburban dad, but his eyes are friendly and his weird, jagged laugh is kind of funny. And he treats us like we're adults, like he actually cares about what we think and feel. Most teachers talk down to us as if we're a bunch of immature dummies who don't know anything about anything. I don't know if anyone's told Mr. Ingman about my dead sister because he doesn't look at me as if I were some sad cripple. I won't read any more than that, but she goes on to just share this memory or experience that happens in this classroom that kind of builds on this character. But I really like I think that's a pretty basic way when you're introducing a character, you talk about their traits. Now let's compare that to another teacher. This is on page 34. Okay, I'm going to start, if you're numbering the paragraphs, from the break starts on page 33, and I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and at the bottom of the 6th paragraph, which is extra long in my book, at the bottom of page 34, leading into the next paragraph on 35, page 35. See how the author chooses to introduce Mr. Simmons. Not only do I hate math with every fiber of my being, I suspect my teacher, Mr. Simmons, is a racist Republican. He has a handlebar mustache, and his desk is covered with American flags. He even has a tiny Confederate one he probably thinks we don't notice. What kind of person would have something like that? He also has a dumb Ronald Reagan quote about jelly beans taped to the wall, which is another obvious clue. You can tell a lot about a fellow's character by the way he eats jelly beans. What does that even mean? How exactly do people eat jelly beans differently? Is that supposed to be deep or something? No one else seems to notice or care about these kinds of things, though I tried to explain it to Lorena, but she just shrugged and said, white people. So it's a totally different way of introducing a character. It's very Nathaniel Hawthorne-esque, where you meet the character and there's some descriptions of the environment of that character. She describes things around the desk that are clues, and she infers things about Mr. Simmons, but then you go on and she, once again, just like when she was talking about Mr. Ingman, goes on to share a not so great memory about an experience with the teacher. So 2 that are worth exploring and using in your own writing, where you could introduce a character, even like if you're writing a paper on or an essay on a person, you could do very direct explanation about that person by introducing their character traits, or indirectly by introducing the environment or describing the environment of which they live or work in. So the third ongoing thing you can look for, and maybe even turn to like any random page in here and get a sense of, just like as we did in the first activity when we were talking about the narrative's voice and style. But the other thing you can focus on is conflict. What keeps any story interesting is the conflict, and I feel like the conflict is probably relatable for most young adults. I know it was for me, or would be for me, because most of the conflict has to do between Julia and her mom, her parents, and the conflict between them, basically her entire family. She's the black sheep of sorts, and something that I think maybe most young adults can relate to a little bit. There's lots of examples, but I'll focus on one passage in particular where you could have a discussion on conflict and then talk about the conflict in literary terms and teach that with students. Is on page 26. It's the beginning of chapter 3, where she's in trouble. I'll just focus on the first 2 paragraphs. I didn't know things could get any worse at home, but apparently they can. The apartment feels like the play The House of Bernarda Alba, but much less interesting. Just like the crazy and grieving mother, Amma keeps all the blinds and curtains drawn, which makes our cramped apartment even more stuffy and depressing. Because of my punishment for going into Olga's room, all I can do is read, draw, and write in my journal. Amma also took away my phone. I can't even close my bedroom door because she opens it as soon as I do. When I tell her I need privacy, she laughs and tells me I've become too Americanized. Privacy. I never had any privacy when I was a girl. You kids here think you can do whatever you want, she says. So, what are all the levels of conflict in that? One, of course, there's a conflict between her and her mom. Then her mom's going through her own conflict, which is grief, which is evident if you want to read and reread with students that first paragraph. They're grieving her dead sister. But the other one that I think is could start a good discussion for advanced and more mature students probably, is the conflict between old cultural values and becoming Americanized, which I think is really interesting. In the way that the author, Erika Sanchez, like discusses that in the book, and maybe it's worth discussing with students, is how our parents have certain expectations for us, and then there's the world. And I think that's the major conflict that Julia is going through in the text. It's definitely the one that I connected with the most. She has these parents at home who are very traditional, but she's having to live this blended life where at home things are very traditional, but then at school things are very Americanized. Even her friends are very Americanized. And what are the implications, and how does that create conflict for her internally and externally? It does in a lot of ways, and that's a great thing to pinpoint and focus on if you read the entire text. And then how do we connect as readers with that kind of conflict? Have we ever experienced something like that? Did your upbringing or the expectations of your parents or guardians ever create conflict between you and the world? When I was in the 7th grade, my family moved me to private school, and my friendship base became really dominantly white. And it was a real culture shock to see what expectations were for my friends then based versus the expectations my parents had on me. Very different, a lot less in a way. And I found myself being at conflict and having to often defend my parents when I didn't have free range to do whatever I wanted, much like a lot of my friends did have the room to do. But I think I never knew how to deal with that as a teen. I would get defensive about my parents and end up having to really just apologize for them. And I think now we're in a place where I wish I knew better. I wish I had the discussion and learned to not apologize, just recognize, hey, things are different. And I come from a different background than my friends, and I didn't know everything would turn out okay for me in the end. And I shouldn't have to apologize for my parents the way that they are, just to manage the discomfort of my white friends. Like, white discomfort is worth challenging, I think, is a thing that I have learned in my older life. And I think there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it, but regardless, I do think it is nice to have a conversation about how to manage life with parents who are different than you, with your students. I know one of the best, maybe not best advice, I thought it was good advice. Some of my students at the time thought it was good advice, but I have had conversations with students one-on-one who were upset with their parents for one reason or another. And I got good advice from listening to Loveline, an old radio show, which just said, hey, listen, your parents are your parents. They're the way they are. Hopefully they're not abusive to you, but I don't think you're going to change the way that you think. You just need to keep your head down these last couple of years in high school and love them and accept them the way they are, and then move out in a respectful way. And I don't think that's being disrespectful, but it's it's a way to accept your parents the way they are, and then also accept what you got to do as a young adult. Eventually, you have to mature enough to move out and kind of find your way and make your own mistakes, which I made plenty of. So, didn't mean to get that much on a tangent, but I think that hopefully shares with you why this was such an important book for me, and I had a lot of standout self-reflection time through Julia and what she went through. The book is really good, how it breaks it up. If you're going to break it up into 3 parts, like the beginning, you see a lot of the focus is on the conflict between living in this blended life, and then towards the middle, you see how it's consumed with just traditional lifestyle. You'll see what I mean when Julia has to leave her parents' house and she has to live very traditionally and just embedded in her own culture 100% of the time, and that's really interesting. And then coming back to that blended Americanized life and how she copes with that after having the experiences she does. And so it's really worth looking into. Erika L. Sanchez, and I can't wait to read some of her other books. And I think that's it for today. This has been long enough. I hope you enjoyed it. So until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your students, and take care of each other.